All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today with Advantage Kentucky Alliance for our Lunch and Learn webinar. We're glad to have you all here. I am recording today's webinar, so we will be sending out the link. If you would like to refer back to it, you will have access to that. And just to give you an introduction to who we are, Advantage Kentucky Alliance is the official representative of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership National Network here in Kentucky. We are focused on helping small and medium-sized manufacturers thrive in today's technology-driven economy, and we help our manufacturers become more globally competitive so that they can retain and even create additional industry and jobs within the state of Kentucky. So Advantage Kentucky Alliance has received CARES Act funding to help alleviate the impacts from COVID-19 to Kentucky manufacturers. And so this funding allows us to provide no-cost services to manufacturers around Kentucky. These services include a showcase video that highlights your business. We have operational maintenance and supply chain assessments, a health and safety gap analysis, COVID-19 reopening audit, and these are all no-cost services that Advantage Kentucky provides. If you would like more information on any of those, please feel free to contact us. We would love to share with you some more information. And today's webinar is on food safety regulations, and our presenter is Keith Spencer. He is the Senior Environmental Health and Safety Specialist at Advantage Kentucky Alliance. Keith's experience includes 30 years of environmental health and safety management in federal and state government, consulting, general industry, healthcare, and university instruction. He is a master level registered professional industrial hygienist, and we are glad to have him here with us today. Please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. You can put them in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, and then we will have a question and answer period at the end. So please feel free to ask any questions you have. And I will now turn the time over to Keith.
All right, good lunchtime, everybody. My name is Keith Spencer, and today we're going to talk about some food safety. And let me see if I can get this going here. All right, kind of what Kim just said, we're going to be talking about some food safety standards. We're going to talk about USDA regulations, primarily the new Food Safety Modernization Act requirements and how they compare with the HACCP plan, and then throw in some ISO quality or ISO standards for food safety, the 22,000 stuff, and go from there, because I'm not quite sure we'll be able to dive into everything that was on the original brochure. So let's get started. Again, today we're going to talk about HACCP plans and HACCP systems, both. We're going to talk about the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is relatively new. I think the last implementation date on that was September 2019, so that's a pretty new thing. And then the ISO 22000 standard for food safety management systems. All of these are really management systems. They're all relatively similar. Everything's based off the HACCP. That's why we're still going to talk about that. Everything the last 30, 40 years has been based off of that system. So if you're interested in some good reading, you can go to Title 21 in the Code of Federal Regulations, parts 1 through 190, and that is all of the FDA federal regulations. But what we're going to focus on today are parts 117, which is the new Food Safety Modernization Act, and then part 120, which is the HACCP systems. And so let's start talking about what 117 contains. It's primarily two things. First, the current good manufacturing practices, which they call CGMPs, and then it has the sort of HACCP replacement, the hazard analysis and risk-based preventative controls for human food, which they call HACCP. So, all right. And as you can notice, I've highlighted subpart B and subpart C. Those are the things that we're going to talk about. There's also a supply chain program requirement things in there. But first, before we can have a HACCP plan, before we can have a food safety plan, which is what it's called in the new Modernization Act, we have to have things called good management practices or current good management practices. There's 9 of them listed in the new Food Modernization Act, and we'll talk about 8 of them. We're going to skip the byproducts for animal food kind of stuff. Unless you're a distillery, then you might be a little interested in that. All right, so one of the 9 good management practices for preparation for a HACCP plan or a HARP-C plan is personnel. And we're not going to go over all of the standards, just the primary points. Disease control, you've got to make sure that your employees and contractors and anyone who's going to be in any area that has the potential for contamination or causing any kind of cross-contamination, touching food contact surfaces, anything like that, that they have to be in proper medical condition to do that. If they appear that they're sick, okay, especially with the COVID stuff now, that's going to have a little additional screening with that probably. They can't be sick or appear to have an illness or symptoms of an illness, lesions, boils, sores, infections, any of that kind of stuff. All right, obviously number 1. And they have to be clean, okay? You want the people that are going to be working in those areas to be hygienically appropriate. So that's part of one of the good management practices. So one of them is personnel, make sure everybody's feeling well, make sure they don't have any infections or open lesions, boils, anything on their skin. The second good management practice is plant and grounds. The grounds about the food processing plant have to be kept in a condition to protect against any kind of food contamination, proper storage of your litter and your waste and your cuttings, and there's a section in here on pest harborage and all that good stuff, and treating your grass with any fertilizers or anything like that. Maintaining your roads and parking lots so that they're not a source of contamination, generating too much airborne stuff that could come into the facility. Adequate drainage so that we don't have a breeding place for pests. Any kind of waste treatment or disposal system that you have to be operating in a adequate manner. And if you're bordered by grounds not under your control, okay, however, and one of these things that we discussed is a potential there, then you have to sort of work something out with that, and especially make sure that pests, dirt, and filth, anything like that from a neighbor can't get incorporated into your manufacturing process. Okay, so Also with plants and grounds, you've got to be constructed to have enough room for proper operation to prevent any chance of cross-contamination. The construction and operation of the facility must be appropriate, okay? And again, the primary problem with the plant construction itself is, the chance of cross-contamination, either from allergens outside, okay, from filth or other kind of extraneous materials. And then inside the plant, make sure that you have control systems in place, partitioning that you need, just reducing the risk of cross-contamination, which in the new standard, they require you to generate zones within your facility, okay, to help prevent cross-contamination. But that's not in the GMP, that's more in the Modernization Act. Adequate lighting, adequate hand washing, dressing rooms and lockers and toilet rooms and all of those, okay, have to be in proper condition and have to be provided. And adequate ventilation and control equipment to minimize dust, odors, vapors, allergens, anything that could cross-contaminate food. And all of that is pretty much the requirements for your plant and grounds. And once again, for the third time, talking about protecting against pests and rodents and things like that. So now that we have proper grounds and personnel and buildings, sanitary operations says that your facility has to be maintained in a clean and sanitary condition and kept in that state for the manufacture of food products, okay? And cleaning and sanitizing of your equipment, your utensils, and all of that stuff, again, has to be in a method to prevent contamination of food. So, whoops, wrong button. There we go. Each plant has to be equipped with sanitary facilities. Water supply has to be adequate. And any water that contacts food surfaces, packaging materials has to be of sanitary quality. Running water has to be of appropriate temperature. You have to have hot water in your restrooms and all of that good stuff. All right, so water quality is one of the primary aspects of having your sanitary controls. Plumbing has to be adequate, and it has to carry the quantity of water you expect to generate, both sanitary water and processed water. Convey your sewage and your liquid waste from the plant. Avoid generating a source of contamination, and floor drainage obviously has to be adequate, and there's no backflow from the supply system or from the sewer system, so you need a backflow prevention device, okay, on all of your outgoing water systems. And sewage disposal, you have to dispose of your sewage adequately through a system or through any other adequate means. That's a touchy one because different areas of the country, different states, sometimes different counties will have different requirements for sewage. Whoops, sorry. I was just going to try to highlight that. And adequate means is a pretty broad subject. So that's sort of on a case-by-case basis. And you must provide toilet facilities that are adequate, readily accessible, must be clean, and again, must have hot running water for the washing of hands. And your rubbish disposal must be to where you don't accumulate rubbish or trash at the site, and then having that be an attractant for pests and rodents. Next one, equipment and utensils. And these are all the good management practice things that we have to have in place prior to instituting a HACCP system or a HARP-C system, okay, which are the requirements that we'll talk about a little bit later. So these are all just precursors. So there's quite a bit of them. So there's quite a bit of stuff to do. Plant equipment, utensils that are going to be used that have the potential to contact food must be adequately cleanable and maintained in that state. And gosh, dog, again, sorry. Whoop, where am I going? I think I messed up there. Here we go. Close. Sorry, everybody. They have to be designed, constructed, and used appropriately. Anything with lubricants, fuel, metal fragments, contaminated water, any of those other things have to be avoided. So your utensils and your equipment have to be constructed for food grade, basically. And has to be installed, cleaned, and maintained. And contact surfaces have to be corrosion resistant. And they must be made of non-toxic materials and be able to withstand their environment. So, and withstand the cleaning procedures that you have in place. Food contact surfaces have to be maintained, again, in a clean and sanitary condition. Seams on food contact surfaces have to be smoothly bonded and maintained to minimize the accumulation of food and particles. It doesn't say eliminate, it says minimize. So you can have food contact surface seams, but they have to be manageable and be able to be kept clean. Again, holding, conveying, manufacturing systems, again, cleanliness, sanitation is all of this stuff. Any cold storage, okay, has to be fitted with a thermometer, some kind of temperature measuring device, and recording device also, because as part of either of these plans, anything that has a critical control point that's a temperature, okay, that has to be recorded. All right. And if you do use compressed air or other plant gases, if they could be introduced into food or on food surfaces, they have to be treated so that they are not going to contaminate the food. Okay. Processes and controls, which is the biggest one. Excuse me. All operations have to be conducted in accordance with sanitation principles. Quality control measures have to be put in place to ensure that the food is suitable for consumption. And the overall sanitation of the plant, which is what we've been talking about for the most part, must be under the supervision of a competent person, okay? You get to choose who that competent person is. On the FDA website, under the FSMA part, they have definitions of what competent individuals or competent persons are, and there's even a little flow chart to determine whether the person you want to do this would be deemed competent or not. Okay. And any chemical, microbiological, or extraneous material used for testing, okay, cannot possess a potential for cross-contamination or allergen introduction. Allergens are mentioned really big in this new Food Safety Modernization Act. We'll get into some of that in a little bit, but almost everywhere where previously, before this regulation came out, where you saw contamination, now you will also see allergen, okay? And then any food that's been contaminated or adulterated has to be rejected. So warehousing and distribution, keep your food or your products in condition that'll protect it against any cross-contamination. And when you store it or transport it, if it's temperature dependent, again, all of that has to be checked and monitored. Now, something new, defect action levels. The manufacturer or holder of the food must utilize some kind of quality control system to reduce natural or unavoidable defects to the lowest level currently feasible. All right. The mixing of food containing defects at levels that render the food adulterated with another food is not permitted. Okay. So just like from the environmental standpoint, we can't mix two things together and make it legal. So if a portion of food has been rendered adulterated, we can't unadulterate it by adding something to it. Okay. All right. So once you have all of those good management practices in place, and then you can begin work on either a HACCP system, okay, which has largely been replaced by the new HACCP system, which we will get into. But since everything, even the new stuff, is based off of Part 120 HACCP systems, okay, I wanted to still cover HACCP systems because there's only slight modifications to the HACCP requirements in the new standard or the new act. Okay, so that's why I still wanted to cover HACCP systems. And we at AKA have been asked by several folks about HACCP plans, so they still seem to be desired in some areas of consumable product manufacturing that don't necessarily have to meet the Food Safety Modernization Act requirements. So they're still somewhat in practice. All right, well, kind of skipped ahead there. So what's required for a HACCP system? The current good manufacturing practices that we just went over, sanitation standard operating procedures, and then you get into the nuts and bolts of the thing. You have to conduct a hazard analysis, and you have to determine critical control points and critical limits and corrective actions and verification and all of that good stuff. So let's dive right into it. I'll skip that slide. HACCP is not a mandatory thing for everybody. However, if you are dealing with fish, meat, or juice, it is. All right. And then the new Food Safety Modernization Act, hazard analysis, and the HACCP supersedes HACCP for general food and beverage. Okay. So for those of you who may not be familiar with what a HACCP plan, HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point Plan. It's a management system, just like the HACCP, just like the ISO 22000. They're all management systems. This is the original management system, and it addresses, through analysis and control, biological, chemical, and physical hazards from raw material production, procurement, and handling through manufacturing, distribution, and consumption of consumable products. Okay, the HACCP plan has to be encouraged by top management, just like any management system, to make it do what it's supposed to do. All right, so with all of these, there are some additional prerequisites besides good management practices. So if you have determined that you have your good management practices in place, then there's 5 other things that we have to do prior to developing and implementing our hazard analysis critical control point plan. And that is, we have to, 1, assemble a team. You want that team to be multifaceted from as many different departments within your organization as possible. And then that HACCP team, you have to describe the food and its distribution, its intended use, and the consumers of that food. You have to do a flow diagram of your process, and then you have to verify that flow diagram. And with a HACCP plan, you can either do it for an entire manufacturing facility, or you can do it per process. And if you do it per process, you can have a process team instead of a plant-wide team. Okay, so you can do it for just a process within your manufacturing organization or for the entire process. All right, so the principles of a HACCP plan, which is a systematic approach for identification, evaluation, control of food hazards. Step one, you want to conduct a hazard analysis. And we'll get into each of these in more detail in a few minutes. After the hazard analysis, you need to determine what your critical control points are. What a critical control point is, it's a point within your process that has the potential to introduce some kind of contamination. And the HACCP program does not mention allergens, and there's a few other hazards that the HACCP program, which is the new one, requires that HACCP doesn't. We'll get into that at the end. But once we determine those critical control points, we have to establish limits for those critical control points, whether it's temperature, whether it's humidity, whether it's water content, whatever those critical control limits are, we have to have critical limits for those. And then once we have the critical limits set, how are we going to monitor those critical limits? And that's the primary basis there. So we've got a hazard analysis. We've determined what points in the process are critical, and we've established limits for those critical points, and we are monitoring those points. Principle 5 is corrective actions. No one's perfect. So things are going to fall out of the critical limits occasionally. If they do, what are your corrective action? What's your corrective action process to bring that exceedance from a critical limit back into its operable limits? And then how are we going to verify that those corrective actions were completed? And in the new HACCP program, there's also another step for effectiveness review. Okay, so what was the effectiveness of that corrective action, not just verification that it was done? And then principle 7 in the HACCP plan is what kind of record keeping and documentation requirements you have. All right, so with that, let's get to principle 1. We have to do a hazard analysis. So we have checked our good management practices. They're all in place. We have established our team. We have flow charts. We have verified flow charts. We've done all of that stuff. Now we're going to develop and implement a HACCP plan. So the hazard analysis is where we determine where we might have a critical control point, basically. It's a list of hazards in your process that, if not monitored or controlled, then they could present a reasonable risk to the consumer. Okay, and then as part of that hazard analysis, we also have to determine what that would be, what that illness to the consumer would be, and what its likelihood would be also. And the hazards, we have to list those. And whoops, sorry, let me mute that. Okay, and That's principle 1. There's 7 principles. Principle 2 is taking that information that we determined from our hazard analysis and determining a critical control point for that step in the process. Okay, I muted it, sorry. And we have to be able to control or eliminate that hazard, okay? If we can eliminate it, great. If we can't, we have to control it. And if we control it, we have to define what that acceptable level of control is. And the accurate identification of these critical control points is absolutely paramount. If you miss one, then you can take care of the other 19, but if you missed one, okay, then it can go right through your system. All right, so this is where, in my opinion, the determination of your team being throughout every facet of your organization and being pretty much experts in that area is pretty essential, right? Because if you miss a hazard, and therefore if you miss it, you're not going to assign a critical control point, it could slide through your system, right? And increase the risk of a consumer becoming sick, which is the whole reason of this. All right, so we now have to establish limits for those critical control points. And a critical limit is a maximum and or minimum. With the new one, we absolutely have to have a maximum or minimum, but with this one, you don't. Anyway, it's a value in which biological, chemical, physical parameters are controlled to prevent or eliminate or reduce to an acceptable level the risk of a food safety hazard. Okay, and basically that critical limit determines this stuff's safe or this stuff is not safe. Right? Like cooking beef, for instance. The oven has a certain temperature and a certain time if you're pre-cooking meat to be shipped out. Those are definitely critical control limits, the temperature and the time, okay? And again, each of these critical control points will have at least a control measure, if not multiple control measures to ensure that you're reaching your acceptable levels. And that's kind of it. You can have different processes will have different control limits. So it's very, very process dependent, but you have to have those critical control limits. Once we have those, we got to monitor them. Okay, so we are monitoring a planned sequence of observations to assess whether your limits your critical control points are under control. Okay, and all of this monitoring data also has to be kept. Okay, so any critical control point monitoring that we do has to be preserved as records. And the monitoring here serves 3 main purposes. First, it's essential to food safety, obviously. If we say cooking our food at 150 degrees for 12 minutes, if that happens, then it's safe. We need to make sure we're cooking it at 150 degrees for 12 minutes. And again, it's a tracking process. And thing about this monitoring process, if you're noticing a trend toward generating food that would not be safe for consumption, you can fix your issue before you have to shut down your process. Okay, so you can use it as a tracking tool as well. So secondly, boom, it'll flat out tell you if you've had a deviation or a loss of control of that critical control point. And then you have to implement corrective actions, which is the next process or the next principle in the process. And let's talk about those. If you have deviated from one of those critical limits, you must have a corrective action. That corrective action has to determine and correct the cause of the noncompliance, determine the disposition of the product, and record the corrective actions that have been taken, okay? And these corrective actions have to be developed in advance, all right? So moving backward a little bit, when we're doing our, when we're determining all the hazards, okay, within our process, along with determining that hazard and its likelihood and probability, we also have to determine what the corrective action will be if we encounter that hazard. All right, so with a HACCP plan, your corrective actions are developed in advance. Okay, so I'm sure when I say that, everybody can see a few issues with that. All right, but that's the way the HACCP regulation is written. Okay, and that corrective action has to be specific as to what's to be done and when it's supposed to occur, who is responsible for implementing that, and maintenance of those records are also required. All right, so nobody's perfect. Every once in a while, we're going to have a corrective action. We have to predetermine those when we do our hazard assessments. Verification. Okay, the activities that determine the validity of the HACCP plan, and there's three kinds of verification requirements. There's an initial verification. The initial verification is once you develop your plan, then you have to have someone not associated with that plan come through and verify that you have implemented the activities and the actions that you have put into your plan. Okay, so that can be an outside contractor, it can be someone from another one of your facilities, but someone has to initially verify that you are conforming to your HACCP plan. There's periodic verification, and that's primarily on your monitoring data. So you want to periodically check your monitoring data, and then annually you have to have a system verification. All right, so there's the verification before you start using the plan. There's also an annual re-verification of the plan, okay, with periodic verifications in between. Most of those center on critical control points. All right. Excuse me. And then principle 7, the last one, is the record keeping and documentation requirements. And we talked about those things that we have to keep as documentation. One of those would be your hazard analysis. Okay. One of those is the plan itself, the team, their responsibilities, and the flow diagram that you have to verify before you develop your HACCP plan. And then the critical control points, the critical limits, all monitoring data, all corrective action data, all verification data. Okay, so you have to maintain all of those records. So it doesn't say how long, but a good rule of thumb is 3 years. Okay, but that's strictly a rule of thumb. Okay, you obviously want to keep that data until the next verification, which would be a year for your annual plan verification. Right. So, and that's the 7 principles of HACCP. So basically, and you'll notice the next thing we're going to talk about is quite similar to that. The next thing we're going to talk about is similar to that as well. So you want to determine your hazards. You want to determine critical points for the operation, whatever process that hazard's associated with, and you want to determine the limits of that critical control point, and then you want to monitor that critical control point. You want to have corrective actions, which are pre-developed with the HACCP, okay, on what's going to happen if we go outside of those critical control points. Then we want to verify everything and then keep records. Okay. So, and once again, if you want to dig deeper into HACCP, you can simply go into your browser, all right, and type in 21 CFR Part 120, okay, and it'll pull up the HACCP regulations, okay. So, and those are going to be the exact regulations, not somebody's, you know, read it and try to break it down into simple English. Those will be the actual regs. Okay. So 21 CFR is the regs for the Food and Drug Administration. And then part 120 is hazard analysis, critical control points. So, and then everything else that we'll talk about from a federal regulatory perspective today, well, since we're talking about that, comes from 21 CFR Part 117, okay, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act. And Ms. Kim, how are we doing on time?
I was actually just about to send you a reminder. You have about 5 minutes.
Oh gosh, okay.
Yeah.
So,
you have about 5 minutes left, and then we'll have a question and answer, about 5 minutes for question and answer. Yeah.
So everyone, I'll speed up a little bit, okay? So in 2015, I think it was, they started developing the Food Safety Modernization Act, and it was promulgated or made official in 2016, and there were different implementation dates, but the latest implementation date, which is for a very small business, was September of 2019. So if you are a food manufacturer for food that is a consumable for humans, then you should be looking into the Food Safety Modernization Act requirements. It has 7 major rules. Not all of those are applicable to all parties within the food distribution system. So let's see what they are. Fruits and vegetables is one all by itself. 2, mitigation strategies against intentional adulteration. Okay. They call that, we'll talk about it here in a minute, hopefully if we get there, you have to have what they call a food defense plan. Okay. That's what it's called. So you have to have a food defense plan against intentional adulteration. All right. And then 3 is the preventative controls and best practices. That's the kind of the stuff we just went over. Only instead of a HACCP plan, it's a HARP-C plan, and we'll talk about just the differences, right, to try to get in time. The next is transportation, and then the rest of this stuff is an accreditation system, because now under the new Food Safety Modernization Act, the FDA is going to be sending out inspectors, okay, and you have to somehow become you have to register yourself in the system first, and then secondly, once you're registered, you're submitting yourself for either planned or unplanned audits, so that they're not little walk around inspections anymore. These are audits of your food safety plan, which is what they call it in the new standard. Okay. Okay, so the requirements are you have to prepare, okay, and a written food safety plan. The food safety plan, okay, must be overseen by 1 or more preventative controls. All of that stuff has to be overseen by what we talked about before, the qualified individual. There's a definition and a little check sheet for that now. Contents of food safety plan, okay, it has to have your written hazard analysis. The hazard analysis for this versus a HACCP plan is similar, There's a few differences, which we'll get to here in a few minutes. Then you have to have preventative controls. You have to have a supply chain program and a recall plan and written procedures for monitoring your preventative controls. Preventative controls in this are our critical control points in the old one. And then a corrective action process, a verification process, and a records and documents process. So you can see they're quite similar. What's been added, carte blanche, like brand new stuck in there, is the supply chain program and the recall plan, and then your food defense plan. All right, so again, hazard analysis, there's only a couple of real differences, okay, in the two things from the hazard analysis and the HACCP plan, and I'm going to go over those real fast since we are limited on time. All right, so I'm going to pull up my notes here, so I'll be looking down for a second. Okay, there's a nice little chart, okay, in the new standard that goes over what was required of a HACCP plan and what's now required of your food safety plan, okay? Within the hazard analysis, the chemical hazards also now include radiological hazards, okay, and consideration of economically motivated adulteration, okay, which is your food defense plan, okay? So there's those things that are different in the hazard analysis. Secondly, under your controls, okay, your critical control points, you have to include points other than those that are critical control points in the process, okay? And we'll talk about that a little bit here in a minute, okay? You also, and what they're talking about there is the reasonable foreseeable hazards, okay? So let's see, hazards that might occur naturally, hazards that might be unintentionally introduced, or things that might be intentionally introduced, okay? All of that has to be included now in your hazard evaluation, right, as compared to the old requirements of the HACCP, okay? And then under, I'll tell you what, I think I'll take it this way. The evaluation has to consider formulation, condition of facilities and equipment, raw materials, transport practices, manufacturing processes, packaging, storage. Again, those sanitation requirements and employee hygiene requirements, and anything that you can reasonably foresee as either a use or as a potential contaminant. Okay. And then for your critical control points, again, we have to include control points other than those that are process related. Okay. And here we talk about controls other than those that are critical control points that are also appropriate for food safety. All right. So you have to include those as well. So when you're doing that flow diagram of your process, okay, if you're unloading grain from a semi-trailer into a pit that's going to carry the grain to do something, okay, sure, you has to be some kind of control for water flow getting into that pit. You've got to have some kind of magnet for your grains to go through to make sure there's no metals. But you also have to consider now, are there going to be any potential allergens into your dump pit? Okay, so you may even have to look at, what's the vegetation around the facility. It expands it quite a bit in some respects. Okay. Process controls, that's pretty much the same as the old one. And other than you have to have a minimum and a maximum both, like we talked about when we were going over the HACCP plan. Okay. So your critical limits have to be minimum and a maximum. So you have to have instead of a critical limit, okay, now you have to have a critical range, okay? And for monitoring, monitoring is the same. Corrective actions are pretty much the same, okay? And verification and validation and all of that stuff is very close to the same as the HACCP plan. One thing I want to go over on preventative controls that's new is the allergens we talked about. Food allergy controls include procedures, practices, and processes to control food allergens. And the food allergen controls must include things that are employed for ensuring the protection of the food from allergen cross contact, including during storage, handling, and use. And then there used to be a whole section just on labeling. Labeling is all wrapped into this new 117, or part 117, sorry. And labeling the finished food, including ensuring that the finished food is not misbranded, okay? If you are controlling and protecting your food from allergen contact and cross contact, then you don't have to label your food as having a potential allergen, okay? So that allergen labeling is now pretty important. Sanitation controls, we talked about all of that earlier. Here's the other new thing, supply chain controls, okay? You have to have supply chain controls, things that you can either control or influence, okay? So you as a customer have a pretty decent amount of control over your supplier, for instance, okay? And then you have to have a recall plan, okay? Recalls were covered somewhere else in the old standard or in the old regulations. Now you have to have a recall plan included into your food safety plan. And the recall plan, again, has to include procedures and steps taken, responsibilities, all of those things that would be required for you to quickly and effectively implement a food recall, okay? Breaking it down into its simplest terms, since I'm running out of time, and some kind of disposal process for food that was generated as part of that recall, but you still have on site, okay? And monitoring is just about the same, okay? You have to have procedures for monitoring. You have to monitor all of those critical control points, and you have to maintain records of your monitoring. Corrective actions have to be appropriate to the nature and scale of the problem. And you have to establish and implement those corrective action procedures in advance as appropriate. The presence of a pathogen or indicator of a pathogenic organism must result in product testing, and any environmental pathogen the same. Your corrective action procedures have to describe the steps taken to not only correct, here's another new thing, these require corrective action and preventative action, okay? So we corrected the problem. The oven didn't stay at the temperature we needed to, and we undercooked some beef, okay? How are we going to prevent that from happening again, okay? So with the new system, there's corrective action and there's preventative action. And that's unintentional stuff. Records, you have to keep the same amount of records. You still have to verify everything periodically, annually, and initially. And then the new part here is effectiveness, okay? Your verification activities, you have to verify that your controls are consistently implemented and that they are effective and significantly minimize or prevent the hazard that occurred, okay? So there is a effectiveness review process for all of your corrective actions.
Thank you so much, Keith. It's about time to wrap it up today.
Okay. All right. So, and you have to reanalyze this one every 3 years.
Okay,
That's the last big thing that's different.
very good.
Okay. Sorry. I ran
Okay,
long.
just wanted to make sure we were on time.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank-
Stacy. Thank you, Keith, for your presentation. Does anyone have any quick questions for Keith before we wrap up?
I guess the thing I would want to iterate is if you currently have a HACCP plan, you can tweak that to bring it into compliance with the new HACCP plan requirements. If you don't, because you weren't required to have a HACCP plan, and now you are going to be required to have a HACCP or a food safety plan, then it'll be a bit of work. Okay, so.
All right. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Keith, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I just wanted to let you know we will be sending out a survey about this webinar. So if you would like to ask any questions, or if there was anything that you would like more information about that Keith wasn't able to get to, if you put it in there, I will send it right to Keith.
Yeah,
and
well,
he can get you more.
we'll get you an answer. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And just real quick, our next webinar is December 17th. It is with Larry Clements, and he will be discussing total production maintenance and going over the 8 pillars of maintenance that support it. So if you're interested, please take a look at our website on the events page. The registration is there and more information about it. And if you have any further questions, again, please let us know. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Have a good day, everybody. Bye.
All right. Bye.